Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome everybody to our webinar today. If you do have any questions throughout, we want to make this as interactive and engaging as possible. We don't want it just to be us talking at you. We'd love to hear your feedback. So please feel free to leave your questions or comments in the chat and we'll come through to you as we go through. As a final sort of thing too, there will be some interactive polls throughout the webinar as well. If you would like, please express your interest to the questions that come up on screen. That would be really useful for us, one, to sort of calibrate where our audience is at in terms of fraud and their awareness of that. So for those who don't know me already, so I'm Nick Smart. I am the Chief Intelligence Officer at Crystal Intelligence. I'm joined with me today by our esteemed experts, Sam, Mark, and Wendy. I don't know, guys, you want to just take a couple of minutes and introduce yourselves very quickly?
Hi, everyone. My name's Sam Rogers. I lead Scam Alert at Crystal Intelligence. In the past, I was at the Global Anti-Scam Alliance and Scam Advisor.
Okay, Wendy?
Good afternoon, and thank you to the Crystal team for inviting me to speak today. I'm Wendy Langridge. I've got 25 years experience as a Chief Compliance, MLRO and Board Director, working with traditional finance firms and crypto firms to sort of bring and bridge the gap between the crypto world and regulatory principles. So letting traditional firms innovate into crypto and crypto firms straddle and build that bridge into a more regulated environment.
Thanks, Wendy. And Mark.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Mark Fetterhoff. I'm with AARP's Fraud Watch Network, and AARP is the largest association or nonprofit organization in the United States for older adults. And so one of the things that we do as part of the AARP's Fraud Watch Network is, again, trying to educate people about different types of frauds and scams, as well as provide a victim and just a reporting helpline. And so I work on the helpline team, and we take about 100,000 reports of fraud each year.
Really great. We have an absolutely fantastic panel with us today to talk about it from all sorts of different corners of the picture, from people who work daily with victims like Mark to those of us who try to manage the accounts of individuals who might have been defrauded like Wendy, and people like Sam and myself who just try to provide data to help everyone understand what on earth is going on and look for solutions in the space. So really a great lineup we've got today for you to discuss this topic. So I think the first thing I want to talk about is let's talk a bit about the fraud landscape. And let's talk about what fraud looks like, in 2025, particularly from a cryptocurrency angle. So Sam, I guess we'll come to you first then. So your experience at Gasser and now with Scam Alert, like how do you see the fraud landscape? How has it shifted in the time you've been looking at this sector?
Yeah, well, it's very fast moving, that's for sure. It doesn't stick around long. As soon as new legislation or, a new technology comes out to combat scams, there's always a new rerouting of the activities from these people, and it's constant battle to stay one step ahead. And if you end up finding yourself one step behind, you need to start catching up as fast as possible. The research that I did in the past was mostly related to the victim impact. And certainly what I've seen is that people feel helpless. They don't know who to go to report. They feel like if they do go to the police, for example, it doesn't matter which country you're looking at, they feel like it's going to fall on deaf ears, or the police are going to say they don't have the resources to follow up. And yeah, I mean, certainly in traditional finance, the banking sector seems to be waking up a little bit more to it. There are certain initiatives in the UK, Singapore, Australia, countries like this, where they really are being a bit more proactive. And then when it comes to cryptocurrency, which is obviously our focus, Nick, it does feel like everybody's lagging behind. There's a lot of information out there, but no one really knows what to do with it. So at least that's an overview of what I've seen.
Mark, I think I'll just pick up on some of the points that Sam mentioned then regarding user reports. So obviously your organization mainly works with elderly people who vulnerable people in society. What sort of trends do you see in the types of reports that you receive, or what's the conversations? How have they sort of changed over the years?
Yeah, I've been in this role for 10 years, which, I mean, the evolution of our helpline has really grown times 10 over that time period. And, when I started 10 years ago, we were just taking essentially government imposter scams. Again, like like folks who are reporting, acting like they're from the Treasury Department or from a healthcare department, that type of a thing. But now the scams really have evolved, and the number one thing that we're seeing on our helpline right now is complaints about identity theft. And so, I mean, the amount of data breaches that are out there in the world, I think, lead to that. In addition to that, I think the pandemic really brought on imposter business scams. Again, scammers were posing as Amazon and other major corporations, because they knew we were reliant on those corporations. And then the third most common scam we're seeing right now are romance scams and online dating scams, and which is probably isn't a surprise to any of you, but it seems like scammers want to evolve what they're trying to do, regardless of the scam, into building rapport with their victim, and so they can get more money down the line. And so we see that over and over again with all of our scams, is that building a rapport. And I think that's why romance scams and those online dating scams have grown so much. And I think too, in terms of methods of payment, we're seeing, I mean, cryptocurrency has just exploded in terms of the reports that we're hearing from victims. That's moved from, we don't hear anymore about the wire transfers, the Western Unions and the MoneyGrams of the world that we used to be hearing. Now it's almost all cryptocurrency, peer-to-peer payment apps, and different types of gift card payments as well.
I guess like Wendy, I just want to pick up that. So I think we've got like the victim's perspective, and what the industry, the support industries are saying. But like from a compliance officer and an exchange perspective, how have you seen like fraud shift attitudes inside VASPs that you've worked with or worked for?
I think there is, I mean, there's clearly is a trend of, your classic cons, your classic fraudsters going digital. They're drawn into it. There is, attraction to them because of the anonymity in crypto, the irreversibility of transactions, and in some jurisdictions, a less regulated environment. So there's less consumer protection, which all makes it attractive to sophisticated fraudsters. I think, we've still got our classic frauds around, your fake investment schemes. These, again, as Mark touched on, sometimes linked to romance fraud, encouraging people to invest in crypto schemes. We've got our fake websites, identity theft of individuals and firms being copied. And the FCA, are very hot on the heels of unauthorized crypto VASPs. And then you've got the more sophisticated schemes, I think, that are inherent in the crypto ecosystem. To use the terminology, you've got things like rug pulls, fake coin offerings, some very, very sophisticated strategies that are being employed by people trying to make the most of what they can of vulnerable people, which is brutal at times.
I think that's something that, I'd not worked with people who've been victims of fraud before I started working with Crystal. Like, it wasn't something that I dealt with on a daily basis. And I've been with this company now for about 4 years, but I still can't forget the conversations I've had with people who've lost money and the impact it's had on them, and just the trust, is eroded very, very quickly from them. But I want to turn slightly, and I'm going to make a bit of a controversial statement here, because we always like a good bit of controversy to sort of stoke a bit of discussion on a webinar, sorry. So estimates on the total value of fraud involving cryptocurrency vary, and some of the higher ends are triple-digit billion dollars that's been stolen or defrauded from people in cryptocurrency investment schemes or fake ones. The statement I want to make is, like, does that number, obviously it matters very significantly to the people who've lost it, but does that number mean anything anymore, or is it just watching it explode and mushroom and we have no way to control it? Does the reporting the actual value of the amount of money stolen have the same impact, or are we now almost numb to it? I don't know, Wendy, if you want to have a crack at that one.
Yeah, I would like to think it has impact. I mean, if you look in the UK, 40% of all financial crime is fraud. Now, of that, crypto gets the headlines because it's a very small subsect of scams and financial fraud. I think it's only up to 3%, but the monetary value in crypto grabs the headlines. These are large scale frauds. It's much easier to commit scams on much bigger sums of money. And I think, this is only the tip of the iceberg. We've got to keep fighting against this, trying to keep one step ahead of the scammers and the criminals. This is only the start of the crypto industry. It's here to stay, and I think we have to all accept that and work with the industry and work together to try and combat that as much as possible.
I just think as well, for me particularly, I think that fraud itself for any industry, it's not just, a headache for your compliance officers or your customer support teams. It's also a threat to your business. If your name gets out there, your product gets associated with fraud. We see it a lot with like fake goods, for example, or things like that. If there's fake electronic products or fake medicines or things like that, these are things that are actually quite damaging for any business. So it's not just a case of stopping yourself losing money, but it's also important to maintain the credibility of the industry. I'm just going to say now to our people in the audience, we're going to have a poll question come up now. If you want to vote, we can put the first poll on, please. But just sort of leading back from that point there, I mean, Mark, you speak to a lot of people as well. Do you think the scale of the problem has been, respected well enough now? I know that the United States set up a specific anti-scam task force. They're deploying more resources. The Chinese government, for example, has put lots of pressure on, like the Burmese government, for example, to try and crack down on organized fraud centers in Myanmar. Do you think that the response is proportionate yet, or are we still very early to this conversation?
I think the numbers are so astonishing to so many people that we become immune to them, and then all of a sudden you hear you throw out like the $15 billion in trying to recover funds and different things like that, and I think for so many of us it's just like, well, that's a lot of money, and just across the board it's a lot of money. I will say, kind of just from the victim's perspective, it's not uncommon for someone to hear us for us to call the helpline and to tell us that they lost $1 million as part of a scam like this. But some of the ones that I remember the most, honestly, are someone who calls and says, I just put $10,000 into a crypto ATM, or I just lost $10,000 and that was all I had. And those victims' perspectives, that it's not always about the amount lost during the situation, but it's the amount lost to that person. And when you hear these types of losses, I mean, yes, it does pile up into this big pot of money that I think is getting the attention of lawmakers and getting the attention of law enforcement. But at the same time, I think the numbers are very daunting. And so we don't want to think about that, but then it boils down to that one victim lost, and $10,000 and $3 trillion or whatever is nothing, not even a decimal, but it's it's a lot to that one person, and I think it's important to remember that.
To me, it has echoes of that, perhaps a misappropriated quote, but the Stalin one of, a single death is a tragedy and a million is just a statistic. And I think what can be lost in those big numbers, as you've rightly said, is we lose sight of the individual touch. I want to come to that. So we did some analysis on the reports that we've received at Scam Alert for the past 5 years. We looked at the seasonality of reports. So when do people report scams to Scam Alert as individuals, and are there any sorts of correlations between the times of year? Now, looking at this chart, it's a bit of a spider's web. It's not super wonderful. I guess that's because we've got quite a few values plotted on it. But I do notice that there is a spike around, March through to May, and a second one that occurs later on in the year. So looking at the seasonality of this, I just want to get your guys' opinions on this. Like, why do you think there are those particular times of year where there is an increased amount of reports, not necessarily the frauds themselves, we don't know when they took place, but why do you think people are more compelled to report things at those times of the year? And I guess, Sam, if you want to have a crack. Why do you think people report at that time of year?
Yeah, well, I mean, I do have the benefit. I think the other two speakers, they didn't get to see a bit more of a broken down version of this graph. So I do have a bit of inside information.
I'm gonna make you look clever,
So
Sam. I'm sorry.
yeah, I shouldn't have said anything, should I? Yeah, so one thing that I did notice when I was looking at this, and the majority of the countries on this graph are European. So it did seem that there were certain times of year where there was a bit of a slump. So you can see around August, September to October, there's a big drop across the board. And also March to May, or maybe even towards June as well, there tends to be quite a spike. So I know, at least in the country that I reside in, the Netherlands, this is where most companies have their end of year. But it's also where people start getting things like tax rebates, they get holiday allowances, bonuses, things like this. And that just makes them fresh meat for scammers. So I honestly think that there could be correlation there. And also, perhaps in some regions, this kind of January to April time, that's where a lot of people might see that as kind of a quieter time of year in a lot of places. But for the scammers, they're always working. What I'm interested in really is this slump, where, this August to October time. I would like to look more into this data and try and find out, why are they not so active then? Because to me, I would have thought they would have been 24 hours a day, there would be a threat. But yeah, this is just what I'm looking at from the data and, what I'm seeing.
I guess Wendy, Mark, I'll leave it open to you guys to answer as well. But I think we both talked about was romance frauds and like the courtship period. Like the initial goal of the fraudster is to try and convince the person on the other side to provide them, build up that trust and that relationship. Like, how long do you tend to see that courtship period to be based on, anecdotally, on the cases that you guys have seen before? Whoever wants to take it.
I think I mean it can be it could be very sophisticated, over years. These are not quick things. The very serious romance frauds are horrible, and these criminals can be very well embedded. Then it can go on through a protracted period of time. Just to pick up on Sam's point there, I think you're absolutely right, Sam, with the spikes in May and sort of October time. We're already seeing it. I mean, the current thing at the moment is very much scams on a volume basis, trying to con people into giving money because they're owed winter fuel payments. So that's very topical in the UK. And I agree, who hasn't got an HMRC scam saying that they're owed money back, or scarily that you've got to pay a penalty after your tax return's gone in. So I think you've got, you're right on the peaks on that. But yeah, with the romance scams, these can be very protracted events.
I think too as well. The thing I also was interested here is when people have the most money available to them. So, in December, most people are spending money. Particularly in European countries. Because it's the Christmas period, the winter holiday period. People are spending money, going out. They've got less money available to the scammers to take. Whereas those two periods, right? We've got the March, April, May period, where perhaps they are submitting a tax return or receiving a rebate, or in November, perhaps they've saved up their money for Christmas, ready for the rest of the winter. Like, they've got that kind of the best opportunity to hit them, which I think, we tend to look at scammers as, the old school email fraud guys, and we'll look at the word cloud in a second, but they're actually quite sophisticated when they know to target victims and when they're most vulnerable. But Mark, I guess the question I'd have for you is, like, what compels people to come forward and report something? Like, what's the straw that breaks the camel's back when they finally decide they have to come and call your hotline up and speak to one of your colleagues? Like, what's the thing that motivates them usually?
There's usually a couple things on our end that we hear from folks consistently on the helpline, and I think one of the most common things is that they don't want other people to experience what they've just experienced. And so AARP has one of the biggest reaches in the States with regards to telling older adults about fraud. And so when you can reach 40 million people, they're like, I don't want anyone else to have to deal with this. This was really tricky. I don't understand how I was a victim. And so I don't want anyone else to experience that too. And I think that's one of the very selfless reasons people call our helpline. But additionally, people have no idea if they have any recourse, and so they're trying to figure out if they can get their money back, or what the probability is, and they're trying to talk to some external party who's not a bad guy, because they don't trust anyone right now. And so again, they turn to us and they figure out if, and a lot of the times, our volunteers who are on the helpline are the people who are going to say, you're probably not going to see your money. Especially because maybe the scam happened 3 months ago and they're finally just getting around to reporting it or whatever it may be. And so we see that a lot too, just in terms of trying to get the money back. But I would say the vast majority of people, since we're not law enforcement by any means, will reach out to us just because they want other people to know what happened, and so they don't experience the same thing over.
I'll tell you something. If there's something that can be said about this grim and hideous thing that the criminals are perpetrating, there is still humanity and people wanting to help each other out and fight back, even if their chances of a positive resolution might not be that particularly high. They still want to prevent the next guy from experiencing the same thing. And I think what's fascinating for me is the world of cryptocurrency and blockchain and virtual assets. It's a thriving community, and if you ever go and look on social media platforms, particularly X, and people are discussing cryptocurrency, and it's a very broad church of people who talk about cryptocurrency online, but there are always people discussing who's a scammer, what's a fraud, people trying to help each other out and save each other from making the same mistakes. Unfortunately, there's also grounds where a lot of people are convinced to send money to fraudsters, which is unfortunate. But it is really nice to hear that, there's still some humanity and goodness, even as these people have been sort of very badly hurt by, what the actions of these people are, and particularly for like the romance frauds where trust has really been betrayed. I just want to look also, we did another bit of analysis and we looked at like the most common words that were used inside the reports that were filed with Scam Alert over the same period. It's not a super sophisticated piece of work here. It basically just looked for the most common phrases and the most common words that are used. And you can see here that lots of them involve the word Bitcoin, which seemed to be the most solicited, and at least in our data set was the most solicited cryptocurrency. You can see BTC is up fairly high up there too. But you also look in the phrases, and I think this is what is a more revealing chart, which is you can see a number of words in here talking about phrases you have probably see in those email campaigns that go around saying, a hacker has gained access to your computer. They've gained access to you whilst you're watching some, embarrassing content, and now they are trying to basically blackmail you to provide them with some cryptocurrency. And you can see, malware, adult, webcam, video clip, full access are ones that we see very commonly inside those things. But there are also a few other ones in there too: authorized, registered, authorized firm, authorized firm. I just want to get the response from like the rest of the panelists on this, because obviously you've probably heard a lot of people talk about their experiences. What's the most common sort of statement that you hear when you're talking to a victim? Like, what was the setup or phrase that that sort of gave it away to them that it was a fraud?
To answer that, I think there's sort of three categories of fraud that come up time and time again. There's language around fear, and some of it you've got in here. So it's that pressurizing, that panic situation. Urgent action is required. Forcing people to act without properly thinking things through. Flash up, pop up saying, there is a virus detected on your system, which is falling in sort of the malware type category. There is a suspicious activity on your account if you've got a bank fraud. So it's instilling this sense of fear and urgent response from people. I think that's one angle that we see very, very commonly. You've got the too good to be true thing, and again, you've got some of it here, where you've won a prize, or there's we're gifting you something for free, and that's feeding on people who want think they're going to get something for nothing. That's a very attractive thing as well. But then you've got your official angle where your authorized firms things come in with people claiming to be, again, back to impersonating known identities and authorities. So they are asking you to verify your account information, or maybe click to update your payment details. So it looks very official, it looks very intimidating. And I think, you know, a lot of the buzzwords you've got up on here, you know, are driven by these category, particularly when you get into, you know, more adult entertainment, let's say, like that. You know, it's that fear thing, you know, act now, we've caught you, or we're going to expose you. So again, playing on people's vulnerabilities.
And I think that embarrassment is a really strong motivation, right? Like the feeling of shame. Mark, I think we were speaking before about this, you know, about the feelings of shame and around it. Um, you know, the so-called sextortion, the idea of, you know, convincing, and, you know, there's not fantastic data around it, but, you know, circumstantially, a lot of the data I've seen has been about young men who've been convinced to send compromising footage of themselves to you know, a fraudster who then threatened to blackmail them. How prevalent is this with like the people who call your hotline, or what sort of feelings do they exploit with those people to generally make them do things?
Yeah, I mean, surprisingly enough, too, I mean, we still get plenty of reports from older adults about different types of, you know, sextortion related scams as well. And it's funny, you know, how different people react to it. Some people just think it's foolish, and they can laugh it off. Other people are like, well, I was sending videos with that person, and I'm really concerned that they're going to send it to my church or to my employer, to my school, or whatever it may be. And so we see that type of a thing pretty regularly. But we do, I mean, even though our target audience is not younger people, we still get calls from younger people who are in a panic mode in these situations. They don't even know what our organization is. They don't know that we're like a 50+ organization in terms of age. And so, but they just want someone to talk to about it. And they're like, you know, again, like the demographic you mentioned, we'll get, you know, younger guys or younger girls calling in and saying, you know, I'm dealing with a situation. They're telling me if I don't do this, they're going to send it to my family or my school, and I'm going to lose my scholarship or whatever it may be. If they see that, and so you know, we're getting these. We get these calls pretty regularly too from, again, people of all ages, and sometimes the reaction is so vast. I've talked to you know, like an 80-year-old woman who's just like, yep, I watch inappropriate videos online and I don't care. And I don't care if they have a video of me. And I've had that conversation with people. And at the same time, you know, you're talking to someone else on a different spectrum who's like, I'm going to lose my college scholarship if they see this, and they're panicking, and sometimes people are suicidal in those situations too. And it's just the range of emotions is so vast in those situations that you know, you just, all we can do and all we try to do is be there for the victim and you know, explain kind of the technicalities of how the scam works, and you know, encourage them to disengage to the extent that they can, even though it's a really tough thing for them to do.
I think I want to pick up a point here on the data too, which is I think there is a little bit of an inherent data bias within this data set, which is people have added the text from the scammers, as in they copied the emails and submitted it in the form. Why do you think people are more compelled to share almost impersonal stories, you know, like the ones they can laugh off, you know, such as the, have you ever heard of Pegasus spyware? I think I remember seeing one of those emails once that said, I work for the NSA, or, you know, I work for, you know, GCHQ, you know, big online, you know, espionage agencies, and I've gained access to your system and can do all this sort of thing, which, you know, was a bit humorous at least because it was so far-fetched. But I'm wondering, you know, the majority of the reports that we've seen in this data set seem to be fairly templated and people have done that stuff. Why do you think we don't see so many reports from people who, you know, the guys who might call up Mark or, you know, speak to Wendy about their problems? Why do you think they're more reluctant to come forward and we're more likely to see the ones that make us laugh and report them?
Well, I think that part of it comes down to shame, which has already been mentioned. You know, particularly if it's a teenage boy. I know there was maybe 35 to 40 suicides in the US alone, that were specifically linked with sextortion cases, where perhaps, I know for sure in one case, the boy was sat with his family around the dinner table 20 minutes before he was found dead. He was in a good mood, nothing absolutely nothing seemed wrong. But in the time between him sitting at the table and him going up to his room and ending his life, there had been communications coming through. It was understood they were threatening that we've got illicit images of you. We've stolen through hacking your webcam. They actually didn't even show the pictures or anything like that. So there's a question over whether they even existed. But it was the fear that his family and his friends and his school, like Mark was saying, were going to see all of this, that he was like, well, okay, maybe it could be real. That it led him to actually not even attempt to pay the ransom, which I believe in this case was around $2,000. It would have been difficult for him to get it, but kids are even stealing their parents' credit cards and things like this to get this, try and fix this kind of thing. But I really do think it's shame along the way. People aren't even telling their close family, and I'm talking about adults who've been scammed as well. We discussed with Mark and Wendy earlier that, people, especially elderly people, they may be worried that if they tell someone close to them what's going on, maybe they'll say, okay, mom or pop has had it now. We need to send them to a home because they can't look after themselves and making bad financial decisions. And it's a fear of what's going to happen next. I do think, and I also mentioned this earlier, that there is a real problem with reporting when it comes to who do I report it to. I've heard complaints from both the UK system and the American system of reporting that there is a channel to report to, but nothing happens unless perhaps the value is over a certain amount. And this also pushes people away, because I know that in some places it's well over $1 million or pounds until the authorities really start paying attention and saying, yeah, this is actually something worth going after. And the fact is, most people could lose a lot less than $1 million and they'd still be in absolute financial ruin. We all know it's the fact. So what I hope we can do is start building more of an ecosystem which is inviting, it's educational. We take away the victim blaming, stigma, and we're also able to create a channel that's accessible not only to the victims, but also the law enforcement are able to receive the information that is useful to them. Also the banking sector, the VASPs, anybody that can investigate this and actually make a difference needs to be able to access the same area and all come out with something valuable and worthwhile.
And I think, Sam, like it's really interesting as well, these sort of themes, because it talks a lot about like modern policing and modern law enforcement. And we're not just interested in, catching the guys responsible and, getting the big, bag with swag written on the outside and returning it to its rightful owners. It's also about, the softer side, the social support. It's removing the drivers of fraud and what puts people into positions where they conduct it, but also ensuring that we look after those people who've been affected by the crime. And I think it's a very sad thing that, if you have a relative who dies in a road accident, you will get like lots of victim support. But if you have, your entire month's rent stolen and you're, suddenly having to be hounded by debt collectors and things like that, perhaps people aren't so forgiving because there's a perception, as you said, a stigma that, you're an idiot. Like, how could you fall for something so obvious, or how could you be so greedy to ask for money? And I think the reality is the crooks know this, the criminals know this very well, which is why it's such a lucrative opportunity for them to really punish people. But I think, just moving on to reporting, I think what I'd like to talk about now is like the first 48 hours. And I've used this as it's a bit of an unfortunate thing, because I think, as we all know, most people don't know they've been a victim of fraud in the first 48 hours. When they realize, it can often be months, even years later, that something was awry to begin with. But that first steps going forward, like that submission of a report, what things are critical to be collected in that first 48 hours. So Wendy, I guess, if you were to have, one of your team and someone was saying, okay, I've been a victim of fraud, what were the things that you would want to know as fast as you physically can to have some sort of intervention?
As much information as you could gather in at the earliest opportunity is critical. People forget things. I forget things. If we have to be quite forensic about it. You definitely need to know the transaction hash, the unique ID. That's critical in enabling investigators to be able to track the movement of the crypto, any wallet addresses, what happened when. a really clear timeline of what happened when, and backed up by any communications, emails, WhatsApps, whether it's on Telegram, anything you can to add that story in at a very early stage. And of course, the amounts we're talking about here, but gathering that softer side, the communication, any media posts, emails, texts that you receive, and getting that information up front. And again, to help aid any reporting that you do and get that information across to investigators as soon as possible is absolutely key.
On that though, like obviously, when you're speaking to somebody who's had this happen to them, what's their mental state? I mean, obviously, I can imagine it's never anything other than very distressed, but like, are they usually that coherent? Do they usually have it together, or is it very much, stream of consciousness and you're trying to rush around, organize the information?
I think the stream of consciousness is important because people haven't got time to sort of self-correct. I mean, in all this thing here, we've been talking about people being scammed, and it's really important to stress that anyone can be scammed. These are not just people who are perhaps deemed to be vulnerable. These can equally be really sophisticated professionals in their own right as well. Nobody is excluded from this. And that whole sense of, that culture of blame, which is hideous. There should be no blame attached to anyone who's fallen foul of what is some, very sophisticated criminal activity. That has got to be eliminated. But I think people's recollection of what happened may be self-corrected if you don't get that stream of consciousness at the very early stage in a gentle way. But again, offer the support services. People have to have people to talk to. This is a horrible thing that they've gone through, and they need that reassurance. They need that support. So you're not only asking them to document what's happened, but you're also offering them a metaphorical hug. You're giving people a place of reassurance, a safe space they can go to and talk to openly about what happened, to try and relieve some of that burden that they might be putting upon themselves.
Absolutely. And I think that's, something that we think a lot is, and I think I alluded to in the last point, which was, the social side of this, the psychological damage and the things that come along with, these frauds is almost much bigger than the actual financial loss in some cases. Like, it's absolutely devastating to their self-esteem. And Mark, I guess you've had a few of these conversations too. What sort of challenges have you faced in getting information, from people who've been defrauded?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things that I ask when I'm on the phone with the victim is when did this happen? How long ago did this happen? And try to establish that time frame, because unfortunately, so many of the times when we talk to one of these to a victim, they're like, "Oh, well, this happened 3 weeks ago, or this happened, and it's way too long." And I want to usually level set where they are in this fraud journey. Like, did it just happen? Did it happen? Has it been going on for 7 years? What's really the story here? So we can establish, figure out what are the best resources for that person. And so many times, unfortunately, it's later. It's much more unusual for me to get a call that says, someone says, "Well, it just happened yesterday." And my question to them is, "Well, have you talked to your bank yet?" And for them to say no, that's very rare. And so it's good that I'm glad that they called their bank first before they called us, because they've got to stop that transaction before it's happening. But at the same time, we can then help fill in the blanks of where else they need to start reporting. And I just think that it can be extremely frustrating in a lot of situations. And then that hopeless feeling does start settling in, because they realize that they should have taken action on this a month ago, when maybe there was a still investigation possible, but it's so long, the time has gone by so much. But, it sometimes took that person, maybe a month to get the courage to even tell anyone what had happened too, which is the sad part. And I think one of the good things that I see, especially when I'm out in community and doing presentations, to big groups of older adults, is they're starting to realize that everyone's experiencing like the same amount of fraud attempts that they are. And so they don't feel anymore like they are the only one. And so many times, I think when you are dealing with the victim, they think they are literally the only person who was, dumb enough to be the victim of this scam. And then they realize if they look around the room, everyone else in that room just got that same text message or that same red screen or black screen of death, that they're part of a tech support scam or whatever it may be, or they engaged with a romance scam. And so I think when people start realizing that they're not alone in this journey, then the stigma can kind of come down a little bit, and we can all agree that we need to have these conversations on a daily basis, whether it be laughing about a scam text that we got or understanding what other people are experiencing. So hopefully that information sharing in a casual way will make them not a victim when they do have that attempt.
Yeah, absolutely. Sam, I guess this is your part. How can we empower victims? How can we give them some opportunities to take back control? Like, I know we've had a fairly somber start to this webinar, and it's always a shame to sort of meet people who are obviously nice people and well-meaning, but you have to talk about such somber things. But onto slightly more positive, Sam, how do you propose that we can give something back to the victims? How can we give them some dignity and control back to what's happened to them?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's going to be a long road, that's for sure, and we're only right at the beginning of it now. So I'll explain a little bit about what we've been up to in the last few months and where we hope to take everything in the future. So we've created Scam Alert to try and bring the victims and the investigators closer together. Obviously, this brings its own challenges. Sometimes people, especially if they're hysterical or they're confused, they're angry, it can be difficult for investigators to get really close to the key information quickly in order to make an impact on the case. So what we've done is in conjunction with conversations we've had with victims and also investigators as well, we've been trying to work out how we can create a platform which allows people to report the scam that's happened to them. I call it, without wanting to be patronizing, holding their hand through the process, making sure that they're not overwhelmed by complicated questions. It's important to realize as well, especially with the older folk, that perhaps this cryptocurrency transaction where they've sent money to a scammer may be the first and the last cryptocurrency transaction they ever make. Firstly, because they've been led to make it. Secondly, because they'll never trust it ever again. What we are trying to do is we've created a form which splits off into 4 different categories of scam. So we have fraud, theft, malware, and extortion. Depending on the first couple of questions that we ask in extremely simple terms, we figure out pretty quickly which channel we're going to send people down, and they end up receiving a very easy to use questionnaire, which we are using to collect the information in the order we think is important, or at least makes most sense to the victim themselves. What we end up doing is then processing and enriching that data with information that Crystal Intelligence has already gained. And then we are able to feed that into a report, which you can see a small version of this report form on your screen. It's likely to be 2 or 3 pages long, depending on which type of scam they've been victim of, and also how many transactions have been made. Could make it a lot longer if they've been sending money over a long period of time. But we then create this PDF, which is given back to the victim, along with advice on which agency or authority in their local region they should be taking this to. But we put it out in a format which is designed to be immediately digested and set for investigation by professional investigators. So it doesn't necessarily just spit it back out in the order that we ask the questions. We're putting it in order of importance of information regarding a fast start to an investigation. So like we were talking about the first 48 hours, if we're lucky enough to get in contact with the victim in the first 48 hours, we can give them a case file which is ready to take and is not in a confusing manner. This is something that a lot of the investigators have been complaining about, is that when they first receive contact, it's a flood of information. And maybe if people are a bit more clued up, or maybe sadly it's happened to them before, they might know exactly what order of information is going to be important. Transaction hash, like Wendy explained, the wallet addresses, of course, which cryptocurrencies was it? What something that's helping us in our later plans is, where are you located when this is taking place? Because obviously, when it comes to an investigation, we also have to take into account jurisdiction. And there are some authorities which are more prepared than others to be able to take on this information, and we need to get to the bottom of who that is as fast as we can. So further down the line, where we're hoping to go with this is we're also going to create a back end to Scam Alert where investigators are able to log into our system, look at the database of anonymized data. Our clustering techniques, which Nick is the lead on this, is allowing us to start building profiles of scammers, or at least groups of scammers. We're able to identify payment networks, so wallet addresses which are passing funds between them. And maybe they get used once, but if they touch another wallet that we already know about, immediately we're able to start building a map. And I guess that's what Nick's little nodes here on the screen are supposed to represent. Effectively a map of not only where the funds are going, but who is receiving them and where they're taking them. Where do they cash it out? Do they take it to a centralized exchange? Are they using maybe an exchange in a sanctioned country? Which means that you can start picking up these little clues of who are they, where are they, and how can we get closer to prosecution.
I love it. I want to make these guys pay, and I think what's really drives me and keeps me awake at night is the idea that the people who are doing this have an infinitely better life than the people they affect. It's not it doesn't work well for the person on the side. And as we've heard harrowing stories about people who've taken their own lives, who've been massively disaffected by this kind of situation. So yeah, as Sam said, we have a lot of data in the form. We tried to pull it all together because what we know is that there is a much narrower group of people and there is infrastructure that tries to collect this payment. There are a lot more scam websites, payment addresses, and other things, and there are people operating them, like infinitely more. And of many fraudsters, as we talked about with the email before, they will fire out millions of emails to millions of addresses based on breach data and things like that, to try and gather some money. And their business model is more, it's like a large fishing net rather than a single hook, right? And that's generally how they operate. And our goal is to try and pull them together and understand, which nets belong to which groups, and then that might give us an opportunity to do that, as well as for law enforcement, giving them an idea about, okay, I have victims in this country, in my country, who are connected to victims of a different scam, and that magic threshold suddenly gets a lot easier to get over if you've got a conspiracy of websites operated by the same people. I'd like to pick up one of the points from the poll there. The biggest barrier that investigators have is being able to contact the VASPs quickly. Wendy, can you take it from your side? Obviously, you would have to respond to a lawful order, like from a police officer or maybe from a court order. But if a member of the public comes to you and says, "Hey, I've commissioned an independent investigation," or "I've lost money from your platform," what things can be done on the VASP side, and what sort of actions can you take with that information?
I think it's a lot of these things, if it's a scam. So let's say somebody contacts us and say, I've been defrauded by an individual claiming to work for your firm. That's a very common one. The problem we would have as a VASP is these scams are not us. So the individual could be in a jurisdiction that's not the UK. So again, one step away. The scammer will be undoubtedly in another jurisdiction. So you've got 2 or 3 jurisdictions going on. You've got a victim, but our firm is not involved in any way in any part of this process, and that's really frustrating. So the normal path of events is, you would advise them to talk to their local criminal authorities, quickly inform them that they've been very unfortunately, we believe they've been the victim of a fraud, and they need to go to the police or relevant authorities in their jurisdiction. But it's really hard when you're not directly involved in the scam yourself to know what to do and to know where to go. I would always report these things. I am a big believer in the more information we can pull and give that information and make it available to different jurisdictions and as many authorities as possible, the better it will be again, to bring these perpetrators to task. But it is very difficult because you've got multiple jurisdictions. You've got transactions that, that have clearly been awful for the people involved, but are nothing to do with you as a firm, but you still have, want to help and do your best by them. And that I think is a very difficult thing with a scam, because people are setting themselves up purporting to be from your firm or you personally even, and it's incorrect. And if you report it to your local authorities and you're asked, who was it? Oh, it was someone in country A, and where do they think it came from? Someone in country B. We're not getting the feedback that we do at the moment to get the comfort that that information is being dealt with, or that we're doing the right thing with the information we've received.
I think it's interesting too, is like in the UK we have CFAS, right? For credit risk across financial services, and I note that that's really been effective in stopping loan frauds and mortgage frauds and things like that. You can't just walk from one high street bank to another asking for credit and not having some sort of central register. And I do wonder sometimes, and I think this is what we would love to do with Scam Alert, is have a centralized repository of information that service providers and law enforcement can just dip into and say, okay, this is a fraud. And the other thing I think is interesting too is, I come from a cyber threat intelligence background, so just to sort of like context this is, but one of the easiest things you can do as a fraudster is change the cryptocurrency wallet address that you use to solicit payment from your victims. So, I might be using, a Bitcoin address, BC1P1234 for the first payment, and then I might come up with a new one, BC1P4567 for the second payment. And like a victim from a different fraud or been affected in a different way may report the first one, but may know about the second one. What's really exciting is that the more of this data we're able to aggregate and share, the more chances there are to interrupt scams midstream. By rechecking old addresses that victims have sent money to and asking them follow-up questions. Hey, you sent money to BC1P1234. What was the URL of the website you sent it to? Did you know this has been reported as a fraud by someone else? Maybe you should cease communication with the person you're talking to, and going back in there to try and do that. And for me, I think it goes right back to what Mark said at the start of this, which is people are altruistic. They want to help each other out. They don't want anybody to walk the same path that they did, learn from our mistakes sort of situation. And I really think that platforms like this, even if it's a private sector initiative, are very, very beneficial to helping, improve the outcomes for those people who've been, affected by these things. So yeah, I think this is a side I've stolen from Sam. I think it's an absolutely fantastic quote. Sam, don't get too excited, but this is a really, really important thing too. But the best way to help as an investigator is to sort out the victim first and to help them get that clarity. I know, Wendy, we said the stream of consciousness, like the deluge of information they want to throw at you in the first, 20 minutes of speaking to you on the phone. Is absolutely there, but getting it in a structured way and helping the victim realize that they're doing something that can improve the situation, not just for themselves, but perhaps for others, is such an important thing. I guess that's just almost coming up on time. I think I'll just leave over to you guys to give like your final thoughts. So, Mark, if you were to give some sort of closing thoughts or your top tips or advice for people, maybe not who are victims of fraud, but maybe people who work around victims of fraud, be it at an exchange or a service, what would your advice to them be?
Oh gosh. I mean, I think one of the things that we strive to do on our helpline is again kind of what this slide is saying, to meet victims where they're at in their situation. And I think taking a step back, especially when you hear this over and over and over again about different victims dealing with different situations, we have to remember that victimization is different for every person, and that we really need to again do our best to meet that person where they're at in their situation. That might mean something completely different to one victim versus another, and I think it's critically important that we listen to what they're saying and what they're feeling, and what's going to make them better might not be getting all their money back. It might be, again, someone listening to them, a group that they can talk to, getting them professional help, making them just feel heard, is sometimes the best kind of way of someone recovering in a lot of situations. And the amount of people who've called our helpline, because we work with volunteers, and the volunteers are the ones who are the ones assisting victims. Just having someone be on the phone with them for 20 minutes while they talked about the situation is maybe all the therapy they need in some situations. And so just remembering that personal connection, and that it's not just a transaction, I think is really important. This is a financial crime, and we have to be there for these people.
Absolutely. That's really solid advice. And I really like the humanity side, and the power of a 20-minute phone call. I remember, I was in the army for 12 years, and I never forget being told by, one of the padres, one of the chaplains who came round. He said, never underestimate the value of a clean pair of socks and a cup of tea. And honestly, and it's a very British thing here. I'm sure Wendy and Sam get where I'm coming from on this, but you can never underestimate those two items to sort of improve someone's from some sort of morale. Wendy, what would your advice be? What would your sort of top advice be for this?
I think first and foremost, be extra vigilant, be suspicious of any unsolicited calls, texts, email, especially from people claiming they can help you get back any money you've lost. So be on your guard. But if you have been scammed, do seek that emotional support. I think people have to remember that the scammers are extremely skilled criminals who are there to exploit your human psychology. It's not a reflection of your intelligence. These are very sophisticated criminals, so confide in someone, whether that's your compliance or HR manager at work, or a trusted colleague, member of the family. Never blame yourself. Get support. These things are everyone on this panel today could be the victim of a scam. No one's excluded, so seek that emotional support, and there is absolutely no shame in coming forward, and what you're doing is giving information to help us put these people away.
Fantastic. And I think, again, I pick up on that point slightly. There's if anyone's familiar with this on the call or whatever else, there is a very famous magician and skeptic called James Randi. He's an American chap. I don't even know if I've ever heard of him before. I've spoken about him a few times, but he did a lot of work in the 70s and 80s and exposing faith healers, and trying to catch them out with like the radios and the hidden microphones and things like that. And I think he was also on Johnny Carson's show. And again, I'm not old enough to know Johnny Carson, but I know about James Randi. I'm not trying to date myself somehow. Uh, Mark, I'm sure some of your callers would know who James Randi is, and Johnny Carson, absolutely certainly. But he talks about the difference between a magic trick and fraud, and the difference between the two is that a magic trick, you allow openly the other person to lie to your face. They made a rabbit, they pulled it out of a hat, and you suspend belief and you allow that lie to take place. And he said the difference between a fraud is that you don't have that contract with that other person. They don't tell you that they're lying to you. They don't expose it. And it's very, very harmful for that reason. And I think, the way to look at this, maybe if you are talking to somebody who's a victim of fraud, or you're dealing with someone who's not sure what's going on, or even if you're a victim yourself, is to understand it like it's a sinister magic trick. They're not doing this, to sort of like make you smile, or I don't know, if you're like a child at a birthday party, a bit bored, and sit on the carpet for 5 minutes for the parents to catch their breath. This is about, manipulating you into thinking something that wasn't true is true. And, just as we know full well that there's no way that a human can saw another human in half and stick them back together again, we accept that, and we allow ourselves to believe that. We also know that it's possible to be tricked similarly into surrendering our information or even our money. Sam, I guess I'll give the last words to you then. What would your obvious answers be, or your answers be, to someone who wanted to help a victim first? And you can say scam alert, but I think we've kind of drawn a line under that conclusion. But are there any other bits of advice that you would provide to anybody who's thinking about dealing with fraud?
Yeah, I mean, Wendy made some great points about being, vigilant and being suspicious of anyone who comes back and says, "Hey, I've got a magic trick which will get your money back." That's for sure something to watch out for. And she also mentioned that, anyone can become a scam victim, including us, who are supposed experts. So I did want to point out that that's indeed true. I once scammed the chief of cybercrime for the United Nations. It was it wasn't a real scam. It was a learning experience for the experts at one of our conferences at GASA. But really what I wanted to mention in linking in with that is Pratik asked the question in the chat there about cross-border scams and what international data sharing hurdles do investigators face. Like most of the scams which are originating from countries like Nigeria, India, Romania, authorities are slow or unresponsive. We're actually working on a project at the moment with the UN, which is going to target countries which have quite a low response rate in order to try to make this link that we're building with Scam Alert between victims, VASPs, and law enforcement, and actually making it so that if we can get the governments involved as well, we can actually get them to mandate it so that this ecosystem will become official, and we can actually assist through investigations these authorities to help their own citizens. One of the main problems there is that these countries often get left behind by the wider international community. The wealthier countries look after each other and themselves, whilst a lot of these other countries that are still developing are left by the wayside. So really, my advice is, even if you are in those countries, don't feel like there's absolutely no hope. If we don't have a report, there's absolutely 100% no chance that anything's going to get done about it. So all I can do is encourage people, keep reporting, keep encouraging your family and friends to report as well. And hopefully at some point we will find a way to start closing the door on the scammers.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we'd like to do. And speaking of closing doors, it has been an absolute pleasure to spend an hour with you guys. It's really flown by, and I'm sure there's plenty more stuff that we could talk about and various anecdotes. But I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists, to Mark and to Wendy and to Sam for joining me today. As we said, if you are working with somebody, you know someone who's been a victim of fraud or whatever else, if it's a relative or someone else who's struggling, maybe they're not so technically savvy, you can sit down with them and work through scam alerts form yourself with them. It's not just something that needs to be done by themselves. And if you are a victim of fraud, like, you're not alone. There are many other people who've been affected by this. And please, it might feel shameful, but remember who you're dealing with and who's done this to you. It doesn't make you a lesser person. It's just they're incredibly sophisticated in what they do. Wendy, Mark, Sam, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real blast, and thank you very much to our audience for sticking with us for the whole hour. Thank you.